That's the voice of the late Toronto Cantor Ben Maissner, recorded in May 2024, leading the congregation at Holy Blossom Temple during the synagogue's celebration of his 80th birthday. Maissner was an internationally famous child prodigy musician who was born in Tel Aviv, he liked to tell people, in a stable a block away from Ben Gurion's house. His stirring performances of spiritual Jewish music were a fixture at the Toronto Reform Temple for over 40 years. Maissner died this summer just after his 81st birthday, and he's one of our Honourable Menschen and women, leaders of the Canadian Jewish community whose voices we have lost in recent months, but whose lives and achievements have left an important mark on our country. I'm Ellin Bessner, and this is what Jewish Canada sounds like for Friday, October 31st, 2025. Welcome to North Star, a podcast of the Canadian Jewish News, and made possible thanks to the generous support of the Ira Gluskin and Maxine Granovsky-Gluskin Charitable Foundation. On this edition of Honourable Mention, a recurring series where we explore the rich lives of those we recently lost, you'll hear more about Maissner and four other prominent Canadians, including some household names for people in Montreal and Toronto. And especially as we're about to mark Holocaust Education Week in Canada and Kristallnacht, you'll hear about two Holocaust survivors, including Fainer, whose friends risked their lives in Auschwitz to make her a birthday cake and a heart-shaped card, which many of you may have seen at the Montreal Holocaust Museum or in Toronto at the ROM's recent Auschwitz exhibit. And Professor Ben Schlesinger, who missed the Kindertransport, but his resourceful stepmother found visas for them first to Portugal, then to Canada, where he wrote 26 books about social work at the University of Toronto. And two philanthropists, Sid Stevens, who founded the Sun Youth Social Services Agency in Montreal that helped countless Montrealers living in poverty, and Carole Grafstein of Toronto, dubbed one of the Glitter Girls by a Toronto newspaper for her high society friends who teamed up to throw lavish fundraising charity events and raised millions for hospitals and organizations in Canada and also in Israel. And joining us now is the CJN's obituary writer, Heather Ringel, who has interviewed family and friends of our five Honourable Mention. Welcome to the CJN's North Star again.
Thank you. Shana Tova.
Shana Tova. We're going to start with one of the most well-known philanthropists in Toronto, the late Carole Grafstein. Many people will know the last name, of course, because of her longtime husband, Senator Jerry Grafstein. But she also made headlines in black print in the society pages herself.
Yes, Carole was really a fixture in the 80s with the balls and the fundraisers and all the glitz. Interestingly, I think it was a big opportunity for women who had been raised in a different era to really be able to give back to the community where maybe they hadn't pursued a lot of higher education. She had been raised in a home with a tremendous amount of philanthropy. In fact, both of her grandfathers made huge contributions to Toronto's Jewish community. One was what had co-founded Mount Sinai Hospital, and her other grandfather co-founded Baycrest Home in Toronto. And Carole grew up in Toronto, lived most of her life in Spadina Avenue, very devoted to her parents. And at one point in her life, she actually was on 14 different boards in the city, holding different positions. And indeed, during the 1980s, she was part of a group, I guess they were called the Glitter Girls, who organized these incredible balls and things. In retrospect, I had a little bit of an eye roll when I read that term now, but I think, they did make an incredible contribution to the city. So.
Well, I remember reading, it was actually the Globe and Mail Society columnist. That's why I mentioned the black print, the boldface. Rosemary Sexton named her and her friends well-heeled do-gooders, the Glitter Girls. But they did raise, as she would say, mountains of cash for charity. Maybe you remember, I remember the names like Catherine Nugent, Anna Maria de Souza, who ran the Brazilian Ball, and all these society women, well heeled, as she would call them. But literally, if they didn't have these parties, they wouldn't have things in the Canadian Opera Company's new building or other, as you mentioned. Maybe you can go through some of the ones that she was closest to.
Yeah, she was chair of the Canadian Opera Company. She organized the first breast cancer run walk for the cure back in the day. She was involved with the Canadian Hadassah Israel Cancer Research Fund, Sunnybrook Hospital, North York General Hospital, Toronto Rehab, U of T. What you said, we're so used to these days, that there are these events that are tied to charities, and I think that though they were kind of the first to come up with that idea to raise money back then, and, it really was quite exciting and good for the city as well.
You mentioned the Canadian Opera Company. I read in an old profile that they brought in Yves Saint Laurent for their event, and they raised $1 million, which is a lot in those days.
And again, like, very high profile. That would have been a to have Yves Saint Laurent come to Toronto back in, when he was at the top of his game. I mean, this is, yeah, incredible. And of course, she was married to Senator Jerry Grafstein, uh, and she met him back in the day at Camp New Moon, and a Jewish camp. I guess she was 16. She pretended she didn't know how to swim, so he would help her.
Well, our listeners may be more familiar with one of her more late in life, most recent initiatives. And I'm just going to talk about the color pink and protests after October 7th, or rallies, I should say, by women. What group did she help found literally in her living room?
She founded Canadian Women Against Antisemitism after October 7th, and in fact, she was the first recipient of a pink jacket for that, so she was very involved right up until the end, and she'd been sick for a while, but still very, very involved. Yeah.
Now, she was philanthropy in one way. Sid Stevens from Montreal, I remember, he did it in a different way.
Well, I can tell you for our statistics for the next 3 days, we're looking at helping 1,000 youngsters. That's 350 per day for the next 3 days. Well, we have growing. We have 1,500,000 children go to bed hungry every night in this country, and more people using food banks than ever before. They can't make ends meet. You also have a lot of people that are between the age of 64 and 55 who are too old to recycle in the job market, too young to collect a pension. They have kids too, and they can't afford to pick up the cost for school supplies.
Came from a hard scrabble life. Born in 1940 off St. Lawrence, off the Main. He turned a childhood kind of trying to stay out of trouble into a multi-million-dollar social service agency to help poor kids. And when he passed away in August, even the premier of Quebec was paying tribute to him. Tell us a bit about how Sid Stevens started his charity, Sun Youth, when he was like bar mitzvah age.
He was very interested in helping other youth in the community, and he decided that he wanted to raise money so he could buy sports equipment. And the idea that he came up with a friend of his, Earl de la Peral, was to produce a newspaper, the Clark Street Sun, which was written, I believe, on mimeographed sheets, which he would then rent out for 2 cents a copy and would be passed around the neighborhood. And the paper would have everything from kids' sports scores to whose bar mitzvah and bat mitzvah it was, and the little like local tidbits like that. And that from the Clark Street Sun, the Sun turned into eventually Sun Youth.
Almost like one of the biggest social service agencies in Canada. People from Montreal will know that he went to Baron Bing, he went to Devonshire Elementary, Sir George Williams University, where my dad went. It's the precursor of Concordia. It was kind of the path that Jewish immigrants that grew up in that area took. He wasn't just doing it for Jewish people, Jewish clients. What were some of the things that Sun Youth initiated or did that still exist today?
Well, over the years, they actually established the first food bank in Quebec during the Saguenay flood, which was, I believe, a few years ago. They were very instrumental in trying to make sure that people had relief efforts in that. and also in the 1998 Montreal ice storm. Jewishly, they also did Passover deliveries for the Jewish community. And in the parks, he had ensured that first aid facilities were put in.
Right up on the top of Mount Royal, right.
He also had people working at Sun Youth who could go to court if there were delinquent kids who had court dates, and very involved with the police. He helped set up youth divisions in two of the police, I guess, districts. And it was very touching at the funeral because there was officers who came and paid their respects at the very beginning of the funeral to him at the casket. So it was lovely.
Inside the Sun Youth building, which is on Park Avenue, there's a big sort of wall of photos, 350 pictures of professional athletes who were either clients or volunteers or somehow got into his world, urban youth, struggling youth, and made it through sports, because that's part of what he did so much, was basically getting the Montreal sports teams to give away tickets and free equipment. But he wasn't only doing Sun Youth. He also went into politics for a while. What did he do?
He was a city councillor under Mayor Jean Drapeau, served for one term, figured that he had a better place at Sun Youth. And I think, ironically, speaking of sports, it was suggested at that point, I believe it was in the 1970s, that he might want to change his name from Stavitsky to something else. And his brother Ted has said that growing up, he always dreamed of being a hockey announcer. And when he was suggested to him to change his name, he knew it was going to be Sid Stevens, and that was how that came to be.
I want to ask you about some of the things that he did while he was city councillor. He invented or founded what's now called Infocrime, but it was basically Crime Stoppers. How did that happen?
As far as I know, it was again something that he was dealing with, this sort of gray area in terms of kids and problems and crime in neighborhoods. And it was already something that had been adopted in a couple of Canadian cities, and he brought that to Montreal.
He also was doing things to help not just for people who were committing crimes, but also people who are vulnerable, such as tenants. You mentioned during the floods and during acts of God. But when people were in trouble financially in that area, Montreal off the Main, he and his group used to go. I read this on the obituary section of Paperman's. They would bring blankets and a lawyer to help people who were tenants who were getting evicted. Maybe some of our listeners will remember too, he gave it wasn't like a rodeo, basically. Well, it kind of was. People would donate bikes and poor kids would get them. He was always on the news. Sun Youth was always in the front pages, always on TV. But this bicycle rally, I remember that as a kid, even to this day.
Ever since October 7th, 2023, Muslim and Jewish communities in Canada have been torn apart.
I've known you for 20 years. You've been at my house for Shabbat supper, I don't know how many times. And for 1 second, you can't put down your friend and just hold my hand?
We're fed a constant stream of Jews and Muslims talking at each other, about each other, but rarely do we hear them talking to each other.
Why are you doing this? What's the benefit of doing this?
This podcast aims to do something different. I'm Avi Feingold, a rabbi and a writer with the Canadian Jewish News.
I'm Yafa Sakeja, a Canadian-Palestinian entrepreneur and volunteer with the Canadian Friends of Standing Together.
We're sitting down with Jews and Muslims, Israelis and Palestinians from coast to coast and across the political divide, having difficult conversations in good faith.
We are not the Israeli government. Palestinians are not Hamas.
This is the place where we're both supposed to end up, Israeli and Palestinian, Arab and Jewish.
Subscribe to In Good Faith, wherever you listen to podcasts.
Now, many of our listeners, many Jews, have been in synagogue listening to the cantors and the choirs. And so what better time to remember the life of the Honourable Mention, the Emeritus Cantor Ben Maissner from Holy Blossom Temple in Toronto. He spent 41 years affiliated with that synagogue and passed away July the 19th at the age of 81. Did you ever hear him sing?
I did not, but I certainly heard him sing afterwards. Interestingly, one of his daughters had attended high holiday services just before COVID and really was moved because not only was he singing, but the whole row of 20-something adults, young adults she was sitting with, were also singing along with him and had grown up at Holy Blossom listening to this music. And, that was what he really had hoped for, was the whole passing down music and Judaism from generation to generation. And to see that was quite a moment for her. But as you said, he won accolades, performed all around the world.
Carnegie Hall, even.
Carnegie Hall. He received Germany's Order of Merit, which is one of the country's highest civil honors for bringing Christians and Jews together through music. After he retired, after 40 years as music director and cantor at Holy Blossom, he compiled a repository of cantorial music, which was donated to Israel this year. So he really continued to make an impact. He had an interesting background. He was born in Tel Aviv. His parents were married under the British mandate, and he grew up in a family that was very musical. His uncle, Israel Alter, was the chief cantor of Hanover, the last chief cantor before the war.
What is ingrained in me is the passion of a little shtibel, a Hasidic shtibel in Tel Aviv, one, the intellectual, unbelievable capacity of the one and only Cantor Leib Glanz. The third one is my dear uncle Israel Alter, who was the chief Oberkantor, or the chief cantor in Hanover, Germany. His pedagogical approach, because he was called to the Hebrew College to teach the arts of Chazanut, and of course my youth in this youth movement Bnei Akiva, which was a community singing. We sang the entire service from the beginning to the end. And so these four elements have been ingrained in my DNA of how I became a cantor.
He was in Tel Aviv. He was very interested in violin as well as in cantorial music, but he got into the Bilu school, which was and is renowned for their boys choir. And the head of the Bilu school's wife suggested it was time for him to drop his violin practicing and commitment. Although he did continue through his life, he would play violin for each of his children and grandchildren's birthdays and do a little solo on their lawn. After the Bilu school, he was accepted to study at Hebrew Union College in New York. At that time, they had already recruited Orthodox cantors. This is post-war. They'd kind of poached as many as they could find to get them over to North America to teach. And he was there, went to Cleveland. He went to Philadelphia, where he met his wife. And then they ended up at Holy Blossom. In terms of different performances, one of the quirky who knew is that he performed with the Grateful Dead. He was asked by the conductor who was of the San Francisco Symphony, who was putting together a program that included different voices, an American indigenous person, and they had a gospel choir. They had the Grateful Dead, and they wanted a Sephardic cantor, which he wasn't, but he could do pretty well fake it. He was a great Sephardic cantor when he needed to be, and he flew down, performed, and after the performance, you could hear the Grateful Dead going, "Who is that guy? It's fantastic." So
He used to say, I think, that he was singing in synagogue when he was like a teenager, and even famous celebrities of the day would come to hear him, like cantor Richard Tucker, an American tenor and chazan, or John Pierce. I mean, I remember these names growing up in my home, who told him, "I want to hear you sing." Donnie Kaye, even, which was, an actor at the time. It was much was expected. But he was already singing for, huge audiences, even at a young age.
And he also acted as a mentor to so many cantors who came through Toronto, because we don't have a cantorial school here. And some of those he mentored today he's got one of his proteges, Michael Smolish, is at Temple Israel in Detroit. And another one, Mo Glazeman, is at Congregation Emmanuel in New York City. So one of the things his wife said that was very touching was that this year, Holy Blossom put together a retrospective on all his performances with interviews and comments from people all the way from back in his Philadelphia days, and it really gave him strength when he was sick to watch this, and it gave him pleasure.
At that time also, I remember we were asked whether I should be sent with a children's transport to England. My parents did not go along with it.
What shall I tell you? To go again, we went through, but nobody, if you're not there, you see, you're not a girl with a number on your hands. You can't imagine or you can't understand the hell it was there.
Our next two honorable mention, they were Holocaust survivors. Ben Schlesinger was in Toronto and Fainer. Let's start with the professor, Ben Schlesinger, at the U of T in social work, who passed away July 10th of this year. Why did he make a name for himself? And how did he make a name for himself in social work?
Ben Schlesinger was a professor of social work at U of T. He was actually the first social worker to be elected to the Royal Society. What was interesting is that his background had a very tumultuous turns during the Holocaust and leaving Europe. And he always said that those were the things that really helped him in terms of his profession. And he specialized in families and children and human sexuality. He really learned a lot about himself and felt a lot of empathy for people because of the journey that he took. And one of the things that struck me reading his story is that he was born in 1928, and it's early. And the things that happened to him during the war, he was on the front end. So in terms of being a refugee, he was one of the first. And he was fortunate enough that along the way in this journey, he and his stepmother and his brother were helped tremendously by different Jewish agencies. He was born in Berlin, and his mother died during childbirth. His father really couldn't raise him. He was very small then. So for the first 3 years of his life, he was living with a non-Jewish family. And his father and grandfather and the rest of the family would see him on weekends. They would go to shul together. His father remarried a woman, her name was Gizzy, and took Ben back then. And Ben lived with his dad, his stepmother, and a new brother, Joe. In 1938, his father was arrested along with his grandfather, and they were sent to Poland, where they were originally from. And basically, Ben never saw them again. Now, at the time, again, in 1938, they were getting postcards from them on occasion. So it was very momentous and a horrible day and experience for him losing his dad then, but he didn't think it was a permanent loss because...
Well, it was the whole deception, right?
Yes. His stepmother was very with it, and they could see that there were problems coming. So she got papers for them to leave Germany. They went from Berlin to Belgium, where Ben said he enjoyed the chocolate, and he also started to learn some French. They went Belgium to Paris, Paris to the south of France, and she found out that there were visas being given out for Portugal, and managed to talk her way into getting visas for her two boys and also her sister, who joined them at that point, saying that she was the wife of a Polish soldier who had died. They found out that Canada was going to accept refugees. And again, it was just Polish refugees, which his mother said that was what they were. He came to Montreal, and again, it's 1941. They were the first group of Jewish refugees who came to Canada.
I came to Canada having been bar mitzvahed, knowing now 3 languages. I spoke German, I spoke French fluently, and I spoke Portuguese fluently. But that didn't help me in Montreal because I was enrolled in an English public school. And the first thing we registered was with Jayas, it's Jayas that time, Jewish Immigrant Aid Society. By the way, I later worked for that same agency as a social worker. And I remember very well that every week my mother would send me for a check, for a welfare check that we would get.
His mother started working. He finished school, and through Joyous did some assessments and he was told he could either be very good as either a diplomat or a social worker. And of course, he wanted to be a diplomat. And of course, that was not going to be something that anyone Jewish could do in those days. So he became a social worker and he got to Toronto. He did win accolades all around the world for what he'd done.
When you look at his LinkedIn profiles or his author profiles on Amazon, he wrote 26 books, 250 scholarly articles, as you mentioned. And I'm thinking about what he went through. He had a single mom. His father was a single parent. And some of the books he wrote, like 30, 40 years later, are still on sale. The Family Squeeze, Surviving the Sandwich Generation. Okay, so that's for more people who, are our age. But then The One-Parent Family, Perspectives and Annotated Bibliography, or The Jewish Family. And I just think that is so interesting. We're just about out of time, but we cannot finish without paying tribute to Fainer Fainer. Fainer Fainer's name may not be as well known outside of Montreal, but in the last 6 or 8 months, it's become famous also in Toronto at the ROM, the Royal Ontario Museum. What artifact from her Holocaust experience has been one of the prime exhibits at the Auschwitz not long ago, not far away?
For Fainer's 20th birthday at Auschwitz, the women that she worked with made a beautiful heart-shaped birthday card / book. It was very small, maybe 3 inches by 3 inches in the shape of a heart. And it opened up to origami, almost flowers, the pages, because they had been folded. And each page had messages from the different women she'd worked with, messages of hope and strength that she cherished through the war. She took it with her on the death march at the end of when she left Auschwitz, and she kept it in a drawer in her house, didn't want her kids touching it, and it ended up really becoming a symbol.
And so how did it end up in a Montreal Holocaust Museum and then in part of the Auschwitz?
In the 1980s, one of Fainer's friends was visiting her from New York, and her friend was en route to Montreal, where she was going to become director of the Montreal Holocaust Museum. And they were chatting, and the friend said, by the way, I am going to donate my Auschwitz uniform. I kept it. And Fainer said, well, I have something that I kept. And she went into her bedroom and brought this small heart out. And at the time, her husband was appalled. Her children were appalled that she was donating this because it was so personal to her. And they had no idea that it would become this centerpiece for the museum as well. And that it would also spawn sort of education, because it's something that all the children who go through, and teenagers and tweens, they all look at it. They've made replicas of it. They had her speaking engagements at schools, and it's really so important. They worked in silence, partly because they weren't allowed to talk. Secondly, because they all spoke different languages. A number of things that they needed to get organized to make this. They needed pencils, they needed fabric, they needed scissors, glue. It was just an incredible, dangerous feat. There was a woman who at Auschwitz, as we know, this happens all the time. Someone wrote a note to their husband and ended up being shot for doing that. So writing a birthday card, and also they had presented her with a small cake made with bread and a little bit of margarine over the top. But it was so important to her coworkers for her to just have some normalcy and to do something like that.
As always, Heather, such an honorable job that you do to showcase these honorable mention and community leaders who we recently lost. Thanks so much. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.
And that's what Jewish Canada sounds like for this episode of North Star, made possible thanks to the generous support of the Ira Gluskin and Maxine Gronowski Gluskin Charitable Foundation. You can find out more about Kingston's Sukkah in the Square at the links in our show notes. North Star is produced by Andrea Varsany and Zachary Judah Kaufman. Michael Freeman is the executive producer, and our theme is by Brett Higgins. Thanks for listening.